What happens when the most powerful man in America meets the most powerful man in Wall Street? Well, today I'm talking with Gerard Helferich, who wrote a book called An Unlikely Trust, a book that's about the extraordinary high-stake relationship between President Theodore Roosevelt and financier J.P. Morgan. One was a crusader for moral order, the other a master of quiet influence and financial control. Despite their differences, they shared a sense of duty, moral conviction, and deep influence over the American future. Today, together with Jared, we're going to talk about two high-stakes situations where JP Morgan and Theodore Roosevelt had to collaborate. We're going to talk about the coal strike, and we're going to talk about the panic of 1907. This is endlessly fascinating because I think there's so many lessons that we can learn from their collaboration. Before we get into the episode, you probably love history and you probably hate it when you don't know what your next history read is going to be. Well, I created a list of 100 history books that will completely change your life, and it's free. All you need to do is click the link in the bio, and that's it. Now, enjoy the episode.
I think one way of looking at it is the similarities between the two. Um, by the time my book opens, uh, Morgan is the most uh, powerful man, literally the most powerful man in the United States, even more so than the president. He has overseen this expansion of American industry. And Roosevelt, for his part, has changed the executive branch of the government. He's the most powerful president that we've had. And both of them were able to accomplish those things because of, I think, underlying similarities in their upbringing and similarities in their personalities. For instance, they both were members of a certain social class. Roosevelt was a member of one of the oldest families in New York City, and although his family never had the tremendous wealth of Rockefellers or even the Morgans, for instance, he was very comfortable. He never had to worry about supporting himself. He did have some financial hard times after his cattle ranching business went bust, and he did write 40 books over the course of his life, partially to make more money. But he was comfortable, um, and for his part, Morgan's family was even wealthier. His father was a partner in the largest bank in England, and his job there was to direct European investment to the United States to fund growing American industry. So they both were born with a lot of advantages. They had good educations. Uh, Roosevelt's Roosevelt attended Harvard, graduated from Harvard magna cum laude, and he also attended Columbia Law School for a while, though he didn't graduate. He decided he didn't really want to be a lawyer. So he gave that up and went into politics at an early age. Morgan uh, was educated. His education is not quite as impressive on paper, but he attended a private school in Boston. Later, he went to um, a college in Switzerland, and he was raised specifically to be a banker. Roosevelt was not raised to be a politician. He had an uncle who was in Congress, but in Roosevelt's family, in Roosevelt's social circle, politics was not something that a gentleman did. So his family actively discouraged him from going to politics. On Morgan's side, he was raised to be a banker. His father was a banker, and that's what his father wanted him to do. Another interesting um, re- uh, similarity between the two is that they were both very close to their fathers. I think it's fair to say that in the case of Morgan, his father was probably his most important relationship in his life, more than his children, more than his wife. Roosevelt uh, also called his father the best man that he ever knew. His father died suddenly when he was in his 40s, when Roosevelt was in Harvard. Um, and it was a tremendous blow to Roosevelt. And I think, in a way, Roosevelt spent the rest of his life trying to um, live up to his father's expectations, even though his father was no longer there. Morgan certainly did the same with his father. They were business partners. They had business connections from uh, the time that Morgan was old enough to work to the time his father Junius died. So um, there are a lot of similarities between the two. They both had, for instance, an unstinting sort of Victorian morality. They both had a very fixed sense of right and wrong, and they tried very much to uphold that. Morgan is sometimes portrayed as a robber baron, but I think that that's unfair. He was not like Jay Gould. He wasn't like John Rockefeller. Morgan spent his career trying to establish stability and decency in American business. Um, and he was seen as totally honest. Morgan could move millions of dollars just on his verbal say so. He didn't have to sign anything for things to happen. People had such trust in his name. And Roosevelt also had this sort of strict Victorian morality, very clear sense of right and wrong. The difference, of course, they were both also very strong personalities, which uh, led them to clash at times. But I think the main difference between Roosevelt and Morgan is that although they both had this strict sense of morality, they disagreed on who should wield morality in American business. Morgan felt that the federal government wasn't uh, equipped, wasn't knowledgeable enough, wasn't savvy enough, and wasn't honest enough to control business. He felt that business, i.e., him, should control business because they were better versed in business and they were more trustworthy. So that particular difference led to um, some friction between Morgan and Roosevelt over the course of their careers.
Mm. Yeah, I think what you just mentioned, like that people could trust JP Morgan. You can tell like the way that he makes decisions in his life and the type of morals that he has, it like really comes from his father. And in your book, you had two quotes from Morgan's dad, which I wanted to read for the audience because I believe there's such great advice. Like even really I really felt it. Like Morgan's dad said, "Never under any circumstance do an act which could be called in question if known to the world." Well, that's definitely something that Morgan lived by. And then the second piece of advice was, "Self approbation and a feeling that God approves will bring forth greater happiness than all the world can give." And this is also something you see with JP Morgan, right? Because I remember like at the end of your book, you were talking about how JP Morgan did die wealthy, of course, but not as wealthy
That's
as
right.
people thought. And that's like also because he was such an honest businessman. I think it was Rockefeller who said something along the lines of like he died quite poor for someone who had so much power
Right,
over us or
right. Yeah,
something like that.
he died with an estate of only $80 million. Yeah.
Only 80 million.
But I think for both Roosevelt and Morgan, the fundamental thing that drove them was not money; it was power and control.
Mm,
And Roosevelt loved being president. Um, he did. He was just made for the office. He loved directing things and having an influence over things. And Morgan, in the political side, Morgan was exactly the same way in the business side. Morgan's father, was was very strict with him. He was hard on him. And if you read those letters that he wrote when Morgan was a young man, some of them are quite tough. Early in Morgan's career, he made some business deals that his father didn't approve of. Um, and he thought they were just a little bit on the shady side. And so he was always he always wrote these very stern, moralistic letters to his son. And I think you're right that Morgan adopted that. And that was part of the reason that he was so um, intent on being upright and being honest. And when I say that Morgan spent his career trying to trying to put business on a predictable, decent footing, it wasn't only all out of wanting to do the right thing. It was all he also recognized that that was good for business. So it was a case where what was good was also what was beneficial for interests that he represented.
Hmm. I think you can see like a great difference in upbringing if you like read the letters that JP Morgan's dad wrote for JP Morgan and you read the letters that
Uh,
Rockefeller wrote to his son.
Roosevelt, you mean? Yes.
I know
Oh,
Rockefeller, like there are like these letters of Rockefeller. I think it's a book called
oh,
38
okay.
Letters from Rockefeller to his son.
No,
Have
I
you
don't
read
know.
it? Oh wow, I recommend reading it. And it's like clearly the opposite of what JP Morgan was teaching his son. Like Rockefeller is telling him like you need to conquer, you need
Oh,
to
okay.
take over. And like JP Morgan has got this whole different his dad is this
Well,
whole
the
different
reason I
philosophy,
thought at first
obviously.
you're talking about Roosevelt is that if you read the letters that Roosevelt father wrote to Roosevelt, they're also very different in tone
Mm-hmm.
from the ones that J.P. Morgan's father wrote to him. So, for instance, when Roosevelt went off to Harvard, his father wrote him this very warm letter saying how he knew he had raised him right and he trusted him implicitly, and he was so proud of him, and he knew that he didn't have anything to worry about in terms of how he was going to conduct himself. So they were both fathers were sort of pushing their sons in the same direction, but Roosevelt's father was doing it from a much more positive point of view, whereas Morgan's father was doing it from a sterner, more negative point of view.
And how do you think that affected their personalities in the
I
future?
think that Roosevelt had tremendous self confidence, and it was warranted. I mean, Roosevelt was a brilliant man. He was uh, he was um, he was just a genius. He was brilliant, um, and uh, he I think he got that largely. That it's that feeling of. So I mean, when I say he had a high opinion of himself, I think it was warranted in a way. He was full of energy. He had good ideas. He had certain principles that he more or less held to, and I think a great deal of that came from this confidence. I think knowing that his father loved him and trusted him um, gave him a great deal of confidence, particularly because his father died when Roosevelt was so young that as I say, he internalized that and he felt that that was sort of a way of memorializing his father was to live up to those principles.
Hmm. Yeah, I think like the reason that someone like Roosevelt didn't necessarily like um become like a spoiled rich kid is also because he had like this amount of like a lot of like good love, positive love, but then also like a lot of hardships in life. Like for example, his wife dying, his mom dying at the same
Yes,
day, if I can
right.
remember correctly.
That's right. And of course, he was famously sick as a child. He had to overcome asthma. Um, I think another quality of Roosevelt was he had tremendous empathy. He spent much of his career uh, standing up for the little person against his own class, really. So if you think of the legislation that Roosevelt signed while he was governor of New York, president of the United States, they were things that protected workers, increased education, uh, protected the natural environment for everybody. He really had a genuine empathy for the poor. And he got that from his father also, because his father ran the family business as a young man. And then at a certain point, his father, Theodore Sr., decided that he really wanted to spend the rest of his life in philanthropy, and he became known in New York City as a great philanthropist. He was one of the founders of the Metropolitan Museum. He was one of the founders of the Museum of Natural History, the Children's Orthopedic Hospital. He would go to the newsboys' lodging home where these homeless newsboys lived, and and visit with them once a week. Theodore would sometimes, excuse me, would tag along. So he saw first. He had this example firsthand of um, excuse me, of um, concern for people who didn't have the advantages that he had, and he felt a moral obligation to try to even the score as much as he could.
Hmm. And during these both of their upbringings, did J.P. Morgan and Roosevelt knew each other because they were in the same
They knew
class?
each other slightly. It's an exaggeration to say that Morgan was 21 years older than Roosevelt, than Theodore Roosevelt. So it's an exaggeration to say that Morgan and Theodore Sr. were friends, but they definitely traveled in the same social circles, the same business circles. They worked together in a number of philanthropies. Morgan was also a co-founder of the Museum of Natural History and the Met. So, in fact, the charter for the Museum of Natural History was signed in Roosevelt's drawing room in their house on 20th Street, and Morgan would have been there to sign it along with Theodore Sr. So even though they weren't they didn't know each other well, um, he's not a friend of the family, but they definitely knew of each other.
Okay, okay. And what would you say like the first crisis was that both of them got introduced
Well,
to together? Like they had to figure it
well,
out
there are
together.
two areas where despite their philosophical differences about how the relationship between government and business should be conducted, there are two situations where Roosevelt and Morgan really rose to the situation and worked together to save the country from disaster. They got off to a rocky start when Roosevelt, because of his time as governor of New York, he had a reputation as being anti-business because he was trying to control business. He was trying to have the government control business. That was his philosophy. So in 1902, he became president in September of 1901 after McKinley was assassinated. And one of the first big acts he did as president in 2002 was declare war in a way on the trusts. Trusts and at that time was a synonym for large corporations, especially corporations that had monopoly control over an industry. So when Roosevelt became president, one of the first things he did was file an antitrust suit against J.P. Morgan's railroad monopoly called Northern Securities. It was a company that he had established to control most of the railroads in northwestern United States. And and Morgan felt that he had been blindsided by this, and he was angry. Not so much. I mean, he was angry that Roosevelt was acting against his own one of his own companies, but he was even more angry that Roosevelt had done it without any warning. And he visited Roosevelt in the White House to express his annoyance. And he said, "Look, if you think that we're doing something wrong," and the quote was, "send your man to see my man, and it will try to fix it. Don't just um, file a lawsuit without even warning me that you think we've done something wrong." And that was a real change in attitude. Originally, the government was thought to be there to sort of play a supporting role for business, with things like uh, railroads and patents and uh, financing canals, that sort of thing. Then this movement grew up that this idea grew up that government should be controlling business. But um, and the only way to do it, really, at the time, was thought to be the only way, was through a lawsuit under the uh, um, Sherman Act of 1890. So so Morgan went to Roosevelt, and he absolutely rejected the idea that he said, "We're not there to help you run your trust. We're there to get rid of them." And so initially, the relationship between Morgan and Roosevelt was diametrically opposed. They're often portrayed as the ultimate trust buster and the ultimate trust builder. And in the beginning, that was sort of the tenor they took. But later, that year in 1902, they came together just months later um, to solve a serious crisis that was facing America. In 1902, the country ran on coal. Coal was used in industry. It was used to run the railroads, which were the nation's largest business at the time. It was used to heat homes, to cook. The country, especially in the cities, ran on coal. It was a, um, a type of coal, hard coal called anthracite specifically, not soft coal, not bituminous coal, but this anthracite. And Pennsylvania was the major producer of this type of coal. Pennsylvania produced more than twice as much anthracite as the other 10 the next 10 coal producing states combined. And so the country needed this coal to function. And in May, the United Mine Workers, under the direction of John Mitchell, went on strike. Conditions were horrible for miners. About 1,500 miners died a year in accidents. And it was a rough uh, life. Often they were not paid well. Often they were in uh, virtual economic slavery to the companies they worked for. And uh, so the United Mine Workers struck in Pennsylvania, and this was in spring, and it was a hardship, but it wasn't a crisis until summer started to deepen into fall. And Roosevelt believed that the country was on the verge of um, upheaval, social upheaval, political upheaval. People were going to start freezing to death in their apartments in the eastern cities, and um, and he considered it the worst crisis America had faced since the Civil War. And yet he didn't feel he could do anything because no president had ever interfered in a strike, a worker strike, except on the side of the owners, where they had called in the army to protect the mines or the railroads, or they called in the army against the workers. Um, so Roosevelt was at a loss. However, J.P. Morgan, through his myriad boards that he controlled, um, appointed all of the mine. There were 6 mine presidents involved. He had appointed all 6. He controlled all 6 boards of the companies that the miners were striking against. And yet, ironically, Morgan felt that his hands were tied also, because these mine presidents had a lot of authority, and he couldn't just go out and replace them very easily. He had to cajole them. He had to work with them. But the mine owners were absolutely adamant that they would not negotiate with the union. The union asked for a 10% raise, the elimination of child labor, a 5-day work week. No, I'm sorry, a nine hour work day, and things that to us seem very reasonable. They wanted a commission appointed, a committee appointed that would mediate future disputes with the mine owners. And George Baer, who became the spokesman for the mine owners, was quoted in the newspapers as saying, "Look, these people don't suffer. They don't even speak English." And most of them were from Eastern Europe, the mine workers in Pennsylvania. They were immigrants. And that comment, along this intransigence on the part of the mine owners, turned public sympathy toward the workers in a way that never had happened. Usually, the public was in favor of the owners because they represented order and and stability, and they thought the miners tended to be, anarchists and radicals. In this particular case, the public sided with the miners. Um, but so in October, uh, Roosevelt felt finally that he had to do something. And he called the 6 mine presidents and the leaders of the United Mine Workers to Washington. Absolutely unprecedented action on the part of the president. And he met with them. And he asked them to each give a little statement. And um, the mine presidents were so intransigent, and he felt disrespectful that he said he wanted to throw. This is a paraphrase of a quote, that he wanted to throw George Baer out the window of his office. So at the end of the day, they had met. They had gotten nowhere. In fact, there was a general feeling, which Roosevelt shared, that they were even farther apart than when they started talking. Meanwhile, it's getting later and later into the fall, and Roosevelt is becoming frantic to do something. So finally, his good friend and cabinet member, Elihu Root, went to Roosevelt and said, "Look, what if I had a talk with Morgan, not as a cabinet member, but just as an individual concerned citizen, and I see what we can do." Roosevelt agreed. At that point, he would have agreed to practically anything. He was actually taking steps to call out the army, not against the miners, but to work the mines. And so Elihu Root, I think it was on October 10th, 2002, and J.P. Morgan had this meeting they tried to keep secret, although it leaked out and the press knew that they were talking, on Morgan's yacht, which was moored in the Hudson River. And together, over the course of a couple of hours, they produced this handwritten statement. And one of the great joys in researching this book was to be able to hold this statement in my hand at the Morgan Library. But the statement agreed. It basically agreed to what the miners have been asking for all along, and that was to have an independent commission established to mediate in a binding way. Each side would be bound by what the commission agreed. And but to save face, the mine owners claimed in the final written agreement that was promulgated after this, that they wanted to make it clear that they were not negotiating with the union. They were negotiating with their workers. It was purely to save face, because of course they were negotiating with the union. So that became so that the union agreed to that. It was basically what they were asking for all along. The mine owners agreed because at that point they felt they had been backed into a corner. But they came back with a counter request, demand really, and that was that this commission consist of 5 men, one an army engineer, one a mining engineer, one a member of the coal industry, one a federal judge, and I can't think of who the 5th was. And that was all fine, even though that deck was stacked pretty heavily in favor of the mine owners. The union said, fine, but we would just like to add 2 more members. One to be a Catholic priest, because most of the miners are Catholic. And secondly, we would like someone from a union. And Roosevelt and George Mitchell agreed that it would be the head of one of the railroad unions, the conductors union. And the mine owners absolutely refused in this late night meeting with 2 of the mine representatives in Roosevelt's office. They absolutely refused to have anyone from the unions. And after 2 hours of this frantic discussion, Roosevelt realized that it wasn't the person that they were. Oh, I'm sorry. And the 5th person was supposed to be a sociologist. Roosevelt realized that they didn't care that it was the union head, but they didn't want him called a union head. So Roosevelt said, well, fine, he'll be the sociologist. So he said he was shocked to discover that they'd been arguing here. And if he called it Tweedledum, they would object. But if he called it Tweedledee, they were perfectly in favor of it. So they changed the union representative to be the sociologist. And they went and the mine owners went back to work. They agreed to go back to work. And about 2 months later, this commission ruled, not entirely, but basically in the miners' favor. They got a 10% raise. They got a 9-hour work day. They got the right to arbitration, although the union was not officially recognized. That was something that the miners just would not agree to. They did not manage to do away with child labor, but the victory was seen as the conclusion was seen as a victory. for the miners overall. And so again, there's a case where Morgan, in a way, was negotiating against himself. Um, he was forcing the mine owners to give in. Um, and again, it goes back to this idea of stability and decency. And he believed that the country would be better off, and his business interests, therefore, would be better off if uh, the mine owners gave in on these points. And he was willing to facilitate that instead of looking at his strictly personal interest. And that, and that's helping. Roosevelt is tremendously um, appreciative that Morgan. He wrote him a glowing letter thanking him for his help, and the mine strike really changed the tone of Morgan and Roosevelt's relationship for the rest of Roosevelt's presidency. Morgan's company, as I said, was the first case that Roosevelt had brought, first company that he had sued as president, as for as under the antitrust law. But that was the last one. For the rest of Roosevelt's presidency, he sued more than 40 other companies um, as monopolies, but never again did he sue a Morgan company. And in fact, he bent over backwards sometimes to accommodate Morgan companies in a way that got him criticism as a hypocrite in the press and among the public, and was an issue when he ran for re-election, when he ran for election in 1904. So, so this was the mine strike was a watershed in their relationship. It was also a watershed for relationship between industry and workers, because much of it, it was the beginning of the federal government seeing itself as an arbitrator between industry and labor. And that is basically the model that we still have today. I mean, that was later. It was an informal thing in Roosevelt's time, but it was later codified into law, and mediation groups were set up within the federal government to do exactly that, to mediate between industry and labor. So the mine strike was a watershed in a number of ways.
Hmm. Yeah, like the most fascinating part about that chapter in your book to me was just how childish those coal directors were. Um, Even like Roosevelt says, like, what was it? Like the operators were
Yes.
insolent to me. And then about Mitchell, he said Mitchell behaved with great dignity and moderation. Like it's
Yeah.
completely the opposite. I think John Mitchell's for sure an underrated character in the story too, especially because I did read about his origins after I saw his name in your book, and his rise is spectacular in itself. We could
Yeah.
do a whole
A true
episode about
self-made
that.
man,
Um,
self-educated, self-made, came from very poor circumstances.
yeah, especially because he was even able to finish up
Yeah.
law school as someone who worked in the mines as a child. That's fascinating. There was this moment though during the coal strike, just to step back a little, where Morgan did step up and he bought what was it, like 50,000 tons of coal
Yes.
from wells. Um, in this moment, like, do we know how Roosevelt reacted to that? Was it like, did he feel kind of like maybe Morgan overstepped in that
No, I don't.
situation,
I don't believe
or was
so.
he thankful?
Because at the time, charity in New York there was no public charity, so to speak. I mean, it was all a private thing. And Roosevelt had seen that example from his own father, so I'm sure that Roosevelt took that the way that it was intended, and he appreciated um, Morgan stepping in and trying to help out. And that's why I say, Morgan wasn't a robber baron. I mean, he did have he was decency. What was definitely part of his character traits.
Yeah, because I mean, JP Morgan, by working um, with the coal miners, it basically hurt the company that he had a stake in. Because if those workers are working less hours and they're getting better rights, it probably cuts a bit of
Exactly,
the
and that's why
profits.
I say it goes back to this idea of stability and decency. And his father always taught him one of the most important lessons besides the one you mentioned about honesty, was always to take the long view. And that's what Morgan did throughout his
Mm,
entire career. He was never about making a quick buck. He was always about creating circumstances for his businesses to thrive and for the country to thrive. So this was an example on the coal strike where he was taking the long view. He didn't he was willing to give up a few dollars now for the sake of stabilizing the industry.
hmm. Yeah, I see that like nearly with every great figure. Like they've got such a clear understanding that if they want to achieve great things, they need to have like the long view. I just saw this interview clip of the founder of LinkedIn, and this interviewer asked him like, um, "What are your goals, company goals for the next 2 years?" He said, "I don't think 2 years, 3 years, 4, 5. I only think 10 years. I only step into a company or build a company if I know I'm going to be in it for 10 years,
Right.
and that's the minimum."
And that's
So
the
yeah, you
difference
see that.
between a manager and a visionary.
Mm, yeah, yeah. Um, let's fast forward a few years. There's the panic of 1907. For my viewers who have no clue what that is, could you describe that situation? And then from there, we'll go
Sure.
talk about the roles that J.P. Morgan and Roosevelt
Sure.
played in it.
Um, in 1907, there was no central bank in the United States. I'm sorry, Andrew Jackson, I mean to say, had uh, disbanded the central bank, the United States Bank of the United States, decades before, and um, the United States was suffering with this antiquated, dangerous banking system. There were banks and there were trust companies. They're not to be confused with the trusts that we were talking about before with monopolies. Trust companies, in this sense, are a type of financial institution that take care of wills and estates and that sort of thing that banks were not at the time allowed to handle. Um, but it was really a hodgepodge system. There were a lot of local banks. There was no national control of the economy. There was no central bank. There was no Fed. The Federal Reserve wasn't established until 1913, largely because of the disaster that was nearly averted in 1907. So you had a number of factors uh, sort of piling up here in a perfect storm. You had this antiquated banking system. Oh, and by the way, those banks were largely they had to the reserves that banks had to keep were much smaller than they are now, and banks invested very heavily and speculated, really, especially on the part of the trusts, in stocks and bonds. So you had this highly leveraged, unsupervised banking system. You had a stock market that was down 24%. You had a president that many people considered anti-business, um, and all of these factors uh, sort of piled the kindling for a disaster. The spark was struck in 1907 when a group of brothers named Heinz and a famous um, speculator called Morse tried to corner the copper market by buying a company called United Copper. They borrowed millions of dollars. I can't remember the exact number, but I want to say tens of millions of dollars that they didn't have to try to buy this company. Ultimately, and the stock price rose tremendously because of their buying. Ultimately, they failed to corner the market, and the stock price dropped from 130 to 60. So the brothers owed millions of dollars that they couldn't repay, and uh, they had borrowed so much that the companies that they had borrowed it from couldn't cover the loss if they didn't pay. So uh, not only was this small group of three people facing bankruptcy, but the companies that they had borrowed from suddenly were facing bankruptcy. Banks, trust companies, brokerage companies who had advanced them credit. It was, in many ways, to me, it was reminiscent of the 2007, 2008 financial crisis. Um, And to make it worse, Roosevelt never really, economics was not his strong point. So he wasn't really following it very closely. And in fact, he gave at a sort of a critical time, once this crisis was building up, he gave an anti-business speech that was widely seen as um, as him saying, "Look, it's out of my hands. I don't care what happens." So because there was no central bank, so in 2008, the central bank, the Fed, stepped in and gave the failing companies, if the companies could be saved, they gave them money to tide them through, and they saved financial system. This time, the only person in the country, probably the only person in the world who could have stepped in to save them, to act as a central bank, was J.P. Morgan. And over he came starting at the end of October, I believe it was the 28th of October, he started having these meetings with bankers and the government, and he raised um, a fair amount of money. He put in $25 million of his own money. He got the federal government to agree to a fund of $30 million. He had Rockefeller contribute $10 million. So he put together this cache of money to bail out companies. He made two committees, and this is without any kind of government approval at all. He just did this because it had to be done. He set up a committee to raise the money, and he set up another committee to study which companies could be saved and which couldn't. Um, and these two committees managed to. It looked like they were going to stem the disaster. It looked like they had enough money and things were going to be okay. They were literally sending money to these banks in New York City by wheelbarrows, so they would have enough money to fund the withdrawals that depositors were making. But there were a couple of and the other thing that Morgan did at this time was he personally authorized $30 million from J.P. Morgan Bank to New York City to save New York City from bankruptcy. But the problem was that just when it looked as though everything had been pretty much taken care of, two things arose. One was that um, it became clear that the trust companies specifically were going to need something like $25 million more than they had managed to raise. This was on a Sunday night. This was now we're at November 3rd. It was a Sunday night. The market was going to open at 9 o'clock the next morning, and if it was clear that these trust companies were going to fail, there was going to be a stock market crash. So on the night of November 3rd, Morgan called 100 of the most powerful bankers in the country in New York, which is to say the country, into his library behind his house on Madison Avenue in New York. And he physically locked them in to his library. And they were there from about, I think it was early evening up through 4:30, 5 o'clock the following morning. And this is this tremendous scene of these bankers milling around on the marble floors and marble walls, and people trying to figure out what they're going to do and what their banks will let them do, and then in a separate room, Morgan and a cadre of lieutenants were meeting and looking at different companies to see who could be saved, and finally Morgan called everyone. He came out of his study inside the library, and he called all the bankers together and said, I have here a document that lists all of your banks, and you are going to sign this document, and you're going to fill in how many millions of dollars you're willing to contribute to this fund to loan money to trust companies. And he handed them a gold pen, and the bankers went up one by one, and they each agreed to however many millions of dollars they thought the board of their institution would approve. And by dawn, they had raised $23 million, which was just enough to save the trust companies from failure. At the same time, the same weekend, there was another threat that arose at the last minute. There was a company, a coal mining and railroad company in Tennessee called TC&I, Tennessee Coal and Iron. It was a badly run company, hadn't been profitable, and it was about to fail. But its stock, it was also highly leveraged to the point where if it failed, it would also bring down a number of New York stock companies. And at the same time that Morgan, on that Sunday night, at the same time that he is trying to figure out what to do about the trust companies, he and his partners are trying to figure out what to do about TC&I. It became clear that the only solution, the only way to save this company, the only company that had enough sources to save them, resources to save them, was U.S. Steel, which was a company that Morgan had founded a few years before. And it was the first billion-dollar corporation in the history of the world. But the problem was, and so Morgan wanted to buy TC&I, not because he particularly wanted TC&I, but because he wanted to save. Again, it's the stabilizing influence. He wanted to save the company and save the stock market. And his lieutenants all advised against it. And he said, "No, I think it will work out in the long run. We're going to go ahead and do it." But then, just when they're on the board, so they had been negotiating with the owners of TC&I over how much they were going to pay per share. Just then, as they were about to finalize the deal, an objection was raised that the Roosevelt administration might not approve the sale of TC&I because he might see it as establishing a monopoly in the steel industry. So, at 1 o'clock in the morning or midnight, something like that, two lieutenants, mutual friends of Roosevelt and Morgan, went from New York to Washington, met with the president just as he was finishing breakfast the next morning. And it was literally a case of what Morgan had originally suggested they do: send your man to talk to my man. But in this case, the man was the president himself. And they said, if we do this, this really has to be done. If we do it, will you prosecute us for being a monopoly? And Roosevelt said, no, I don't see any reason we would have to do that. So they telegraphed New York, and the deal was finalized. That they met with Roosevelt 2 hours before the stock market opened. So again, they were able to just avert disaster. There were other hiccups in the following week or two, and little fires kept coming up, and they'd have to put them down. But that was basically the end of the crisis, and it came because Morgan was willing to assume this role that the government was not prepared to assume. And at the end, Roosevelt gave him his assurance that he would not prosecute U.S. Steel.
Yeah, I think like what I noticed in that part of the story was that it was quite funny to see that it felt like J.P. Morgan was kind of like running the country at that moment instead
Absolutely.
of Roosevelt. Because you wrote in your book that Roosevelt was distracted bear hunting during this
Yeah.
crisis, I
When the
believe, during
crisis
the
first broke
panic.
out, Morgan was at a religious meeting down south, and Roosevelt was bear hunting, and they both went back to New York and Washington. But that's how
Mm,
unconcerned
yeah.
Roosevelt was.
You can tell like JP Morgan had like a real influence like over these type of people. Like he had this vast network. Like what type of communicator was he with these bankers? Like was he a very strict communicator? Did he use kind words? Like how did he try to convince these bankers to invest in
He was
this?
a powerful personality. He was an intimidating personality, especially in his later years. He was now in his 60s when this was happening. Um, so he did not sweet talk them. He literally locked them in and said they couldn't leave until he did it. And he called them up one by one and handed them the pen and said, "Okay, now you are going to sign right here, and you're going to write down how much you're going to contribute." So it was not intimidation in the sense that he said, If you don't do this, I'm never doing business with you again. But he had such respect, and he was seen with such an authority figure that people would take this from him in a way that they wouldn't
Mm.
from someone else.
Because was JP Morgan like the biggest banker out of all those people too? Like was because he was a banker, but he also had his own bank, I guess. So was it also the
I don't
biggest
believe
bank
J.P.
in
Morgan
America?
Bank was the largest bank in the United States at the time. I could be wrong about that. Um, but uh, but he was definitely the most important figure in the banking industry. He was, the Lion of
Mm.
Wall Street. He was in more corp. He had the railroad industry had survived in the late 1900s and prospered because of J.P. Morgan. He took over railroads that were in financial trouble, put them on a solid financial footing. They called it Morganization, his process. So he was involved in railroads. He was involved in banks, um, and there's no question that he was the leading industry figure, banking figure uh, in the country, possibly in the world at that point.
Because he was like involved in all these industries, but in role, what role did he play? What was like his like what was he
He
really
well,
good
he
at?
uh, with the railroads, he was really good at seeing how to save them. Basically, that consisted of
Mm.
refinancing their debt and cutting their costs. And the way is, and what he did was, in the process of refinancing the debt, he, um, his bank, he and his partners would take control of the board. So he would, once he saved your railroad, he didn't just didn't let you borrow the money. He actually took control of the railroad. So through that, he controlled railroads all over the country, and he exercised his control that way. Um, in the in the banking industry, um, it was largely because of not only the wealth that he controlled through J.P. Morgan Bank, but as I say, also because of his reputation. Oh, I should say something else
Mm.
about Morgan, which we haven't touched on. He 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 really, more than anyone, shifted American business from a local sort of almost mom and pop model to the modern consolidated business model that we followed ever since. And he did that by consolidating the railroads and banking, but he also did it by funding, by financing huge American corporations such as AT&T, U.S. Steel, International Harvester. So he really transformed American industry. And in fact, he did such a good job at it that he made himself um, obsolete. But when he died, there was literally no one that could take his place because he had come to power at a time when someone could still be the most important business person in the country. And he had grown business and made it more complex to the point where when he died, it was too large and too diverse for any one person to control it the way he did. So he was literally unique in history. He was the first and the last of his
Mm.
type.
Yeah, it's like hard to understand like how big he actually was because like automatically you try to like calculate as in like net worth or how much does he have left because then you automatically go to like okay Rockefeller died with like around 1 billion in like those times dollars, so that's like I don't know $300 billion at this very moment, but then JP Morgan it was like 90, 80. So it's like well yeah it's like difficult to see like how wealthy or how powerful
Right.
he actually
His
was.
he was more, as I say, he was more interested in the power than the wealth. And so he lived very well. I mean, he had mansions, he had yachts, um, he had his Cuban cigars, but that was not what drove him. He didn't. It wasn't looking at figures on a balance sheet that excited him. It was really the feeling that he was
Mm-hmm.
controlling things and he was contributing. Um, and in fact, much of that $80 million in his estate was actually in artwork and rare manuscripts and that sort of thing. It wasn't even in cash or stocks or bonds.
Mm. Um, what you just mentioned is that he mm, played this huge influence in like building all these huge corporations, and it went from like mom and pops to like corporation wise. I think like Theodore Roosevelt is played like that perfect role of making sure it didn't escalate to like only monopolies. Otherwise, we'd probably have these monopolies right now. We've talked about like the skills that J.P. Morgan had in these stories, but we didn't really touch on like Roosevelt. Like, what role did he play? As in, like, what were his main skills that he showcased
Mhm.
during these
That's a
crises?
good question. In the crisis of 1907, he didn't really play much of a role. In fact, if anything, he probably played a minus. Uh,
Maybe that's even like a skill in itself, like knowing when to shut up.
I think he felt out of his league. You know, they say that he had such little understanding of money that every morning his wife Edith would safety pin a $20 bill inside his pants pocket. At the end of the day, when he came home, he couldn't even tell her how he spent it. So I think that he did understand that he was in over his depth and that he really should let Morgan deal with this. Um, in terms of the coal strike, it was sort of the other way around, almost diametrically opposed. Roosevelt took the initiative because he's the one who called the miners together, and he's the one who sent Elihu Root to talk to um, Morgan in New York. So that was a case where Roosevelt really was taking the initiative, drawing on his desire to control things and make things better um, and and solve problems. And Morgan was the one who cooperated at the end. So in a way, sort of, I never really thought about it in those terms before, but in a way, they're sort of mirror. The two crises we're talking about are sort of mirror images of each other, and they both one draws on one figure's strengths more than the other.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Because the call situation felt more like a communication problem, like people just
That's
needed
right.
to be convinced. And then the panic is more like a
That's right.
numbers problem, like the issue could only be solved with
Right. So you could see
loans,
where
etc.
in the first one, the politician, who's the communicator, would be the one to come forward and solve it, and the second one would be the technician, the financier, who would solve it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a perfect perspective. Yeah. Um, to wrap this up, during your research of your book, what was like a maybe something you found along the way in the archives that quite surprised you about
Mhm.
their relationship? Could also be a personal thing to surprise you about
Mhm.
Roosevelt or J.P. Morgan.
Um, I think going into the project, I had a number of common misconceptions that before I really started writing it, when I became interested in the subject and I started looking into it, I realized that those were misconceptions, um, and that was why in the end I wanted to write the book. The misconception that Morgan was a robber baron when he wasn't. The misconception that Roosevelt and Morgan were diametrically opposed throughout Roosevelt's presidency, when actually we've been talking about these two cases, but there are actually other examples we could use too where they worked together throughout Roosevelt's administration. So, in a it was often sort of back channel way they worked together, um, but there was more. Uh, there was more positives there than in their relationship than I would have thought. Um, so I guess, those are two things that surprised me or changed my mind. In terms of just pure, I really love research. In fact, the reason I like to write books like this is because it gives me an excuse to learn so much about the topic. Um, and probably my favorite moment during the research of the book was the one I mentioned earlier, when I was sitting in the Morgan Library in New York, and I got to read this this uh, notebook where Elihu Root had written down the agreement that he had come to with J.P. Morgan that became the basis of solving the coal strike, and you could see he started in pen, and then very soon, I think he realized this was going to be a little trickier than he thought. He switched to pencil, And throughout this, you could see where he'd crossed out things and rewritten, changed wording, and you could sort of see just through this document, you could get a sense of the two of them negotiating and working out the solution in their minds, and him trying to commit it really quickly to paper, and then taking it down to Washington and showing Roosevelt. So I think in terms of the research itself, that was probably the biggest thrill.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, you can really feel how tense the situation was just by reading the negotiation papers, like the way it was written down. It was probably the pencil was pressed against the paper quite hard because of
Exactly.
the
Well,
stress.
you can see the writing is jagged, and you
Yeah.
can tell he's really writing fast and trying to get it down as Morgan is talking or as he's coming up with ideas himself. So it was interesting how the physical object could really kind of capture the feeling in the room when actually the only two people in the room were Morgan and Root.